So let's see a very simple pedigree chart. Okay, so you have a male and a female. They are married and then they give birth to two children. One is a female, another one is a male. And this male marries a female and then they give birth to two children who are females. This female marries a male and then they give birth to two children. One is a male, another one is a female. Now, how do you represent this pedigree analysis? You have to write Roman numeral 1, generation 1, generation 2, generation 3. And the individuals are 1 and 2 here, 1 and 2 here, 1, 2, 1, 2 for this family. At the same time, if you want to represent the entire pedigree chart, you can write like this: 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So these are called as the individuals. So this is how we are representing it. Now, let me show you here the female is affected. So how will you show the female is affected? You can just shade the female box fully. So the female is affected by a genetic disease. It can be any disease. We are not going into that detail. Now this female is affected and she is passing on this disease to her son. And what is the son doing here? When he marries, he is passing on the disease to one of his daughters here. So now you see this particular genetic disorder is passed from the next generation to the next. That is generation 1, 2, 3. You have one affected individual here. Now listen all of you. If you have a chart like this, what are the basics that you should look in for? First thing is that there are only 4 types of traits that can run in a family. There are only 4 types of inheritance of traits. What are the 4 types? First, it can be either dominant trait or it can be a recessive trait. Next one, either it can be an autosomal trait or it can be an X-linked trait. So look at this. So what do you mean by dominant trait? Dominant means even if one gene is present with that dominant character, the particular disease will be expressed in that particular generation for that particular individual. For example, you have in your DNA is a double helical structure like this. So you would have learnt about the structure. Now, you have a gene over here and its complementary gene will be here. So one is called as the paternal strand, another one is called as the maternal strand of DNA. So wherever you find this particular sequence that is responsible for a genetic disease, the same should be present but complementary in the maternal strand. So now, when I say that this particular trait is present and it is said to be dominant, that means if this particular gene is dominant and this particular gene is not dominant. When I say it is not dominant, that means that it is recessive. This gene alone cannot produce the disease. But if a dominant gene is present and if only one is present also, then it will be expressed in that particular individual, in that particular generation. So dominant means what? Even if one single gene is present, it will be able to express the disease. Now let me show you the next one. Here also you have a DNA. and here you have a particular trait, and here you have a particular trait. If this particular trait is said to be recessive, okay, if I say this particular gene is recessive, means it has to have its counterpart also to be recessive. Then only the particular trait that we call it as a recessive trait will be expressed in that particular generation for that individual. So these two genes must be recessive in order to be expressed in that individual. To be expressed, both the genes must be recessive. This is the second one. Now let's see the next one. Now you know what is dominant, what is recessive. Now we are going to go for the next one, that is autosomal and X-linked. So what do you mean by autosomal? Look at this. You have in humans 22 plus 1 XX chromosome or 1 XY chromosome. So these 22 we call them as what? Autosomes. These two are called as allosomes, or we call them as sex chromosomes. So any genetic defect that is found in one of these autosomes, then we call them as what? Autosomal trait. If a particular genetic disease that is caused by a gene is present in one of the genes here in XX or XY, then we call it as what? We call it as sex-linked. Now I need to teach you what is the difference between X and sex. Sex-linked means it can be present either on the X or the Y chromosome. But when I say X, then it has to be definitely present only on the X chromosome. So if the X-linked gene is present on the X chromosome, then it is an X-linked trait. In grade 12 CBSE, we will be studying mostly about X-linked. We do not study, or we don't concentrate much on Y chromosome. So I am not going to touch upon that topic at all. So now you have how many? 22 autosomes, and if the defect is seen in the autosome, then it means that it is an autosomal trait. And every other generation it gets passed on. When I say sex-linked or X-linked, it means that if it is X-linked, it is present on the X chromosome, and this is particular for a male or a female. So that we will be seeing along with some examples. So these are the 4 major traits we are going to study. The autosomal trait can either be dominant or recessive, or sex-linked trait can either be dominant or recessive. So there are 4 traits and their patterns of inheritance we are going to study in grade 12. So next, let's see the assumptions. So what are the assumptions based on which we are going to study about the pedigree chart? The first one is a very important assumption that anyone should go for whenever you are trying to solve a pedigree problem. Look at the first one. For an individual to be affected, the person should carry 2 recessive alleles. If the trait in question is recessive, then 2 alleles are important. That means both the DNA containing that gene should be affected by that particular trait. Then only we call it as a recessive trait pattern of inheritance. And if a person should be affected, at least they should carry 1 dominant allele. Then it is said to be what? A dominant type of inheritance. Next important term that we use in pedigree is rare in population. Individuals marrying into the pedigree are normal and they are not carriers. What do you mean by this? I am drawing a pedigree chart. So there is a male and a female. This male is marrying into the family. So this female is affected. The family in question, the family that we are studying for a genetic inheritance pattern, we assume that some of them are affected. But any person that comes into the family, we assume they are not affected, they are just normal people. If at all a person marrying into the family is affected, it will be given specifically. Otherwise, you assume that the person who is getting into the family is normal and the female here is affected. That means rare in population. That means a person, for example, this male being a carrier or affected gets into the family is a very rare phenomenon. So these are the key clues that can come in handy when you are solving your pedigree. Look at the first one. Unaffected individual cannot have any alleles of dominant trait. So read this sentence carefully, you will be able to understand. So if I say a person, for example, this male or a female is unaffected by a dominant trait. I already told you, for a dominant trait that is running in the family, they should have even one dominant trait. If it is present in one of the DNA, it is enough to express the character. But unaffected individual will not have any alleles. That means it's very simple and clear that not even one single gene in them is affected. That's all. Next one, individuals marrying into family are normal. That I told you already. Unaffected individual can be a carrier of a recessive trait. For example, if I say that this person male, this person female, they get married and they give birth to a female who is affected. Now in this case, I call them as what? Carrying a recessive trait. Why? Because this person male is having what? XY. This female is carrying XX. For example, this X is affected, this X is affected. Okay? And this is supposed to be what? A recessive trait. I already told you, for a recessive trait to express, these two genes should come together. Then only they will be affected. So in this case, these two genes have unfortunately joined together. So that is why a female is born for an unaffected carrier person, so that the female is affected here. Next one, X-linked trait. A single recessive allele is enough for male to be affected. For example, if your affected gene is present in the X chromosome. So what will happen here? The X chromosome is affected and the female is having a normal X. So this will suppress the expression of this. So the female is said to be normal. She is not affected. At the same time, if you have a male, that becomes a problem because there is only one X gene. There is no one to protect this X gene. Why? Because there is only one Y gene over here. So there is no one to suppress this gene. So this gets affected. So the male is affected. Next one, father transmits X-linked gene to daughters and not sons. Why? Because father is giving only X chromosome to a female to form a daughter. And if this is going to be present here in this gene, definitely the daughter will be either affected or she can be a carrier. Mother transmits X-linked gene to both daughters and sons. As you all know, mother has got what? 2 X chromosomes. So definitely she will be carrying this particular gene, affected gene, in one of her X chromosome. If she is going to give it to the father's X, female can be normal, 50% chances. If she is going to give this X to this Y, definitely the male can be affected. Affected male. So there are 50% of chances of either the daughter or the son getting affected.